All right, thank you for logging in. The three of you will be receiving extra credit for actually showing up on this Wednesday morning. Um, so this week you were supposed to read chapter 2 of Stamped. Chapter 2 basically dealt with the landing of the Puritans and the Puritans up in what is Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, and the landing of or the settlement of the colony of Jamestown. But they're taking from a different standpoint because they're looking at the racist history of those two locations. And primarily they're looking at Jamestown. Um, what this sets up, and this is kind of something that's going to come up in the later lessons here, is the root cause of what is now known as the 1619 Project. Does anybody know what the 1619 Project, or have you ever heard of what the 1619 Project is? You can feel free to use the chat if you don't want to unmute the mic, but does anybody know what the 1619 Project is? Either somebody is feverishly typing and is almost done telling me, or the answer is no, you either never heard of it or don't really understand what it is. So, a textbook. In a regulation textbook, what do they really tell you? Whose story do they really tell? And this is something that if I have a regular American history class, I usually hand them the book, and especially my AP kids, this is the AP book. I'll hand them the textbook and say, all right, find for me the very first African American, find for me the very first woman, find for me the very first Latino, the first Asian. Who are the people in the textbook that would be classified as a minority? So of course they start flipping through, and most of the time the first woman that they see is Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams. Most of the time the first Latino they see is until the 20th century, unless you count the people from Mexico that were fighting during the Texas conflict and the Mexican War. And then the first African American, usually if they skip over Crispus Attucks, who was the African American who died as a member of the Sons of Liberty at the Boston Massacre back in 1770, usually the first one they kind of run into is either Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, which is the mid 1800s. Any other depiction is usually just some nameless picture, slaves in a field, females attending Seneca Falls Convention. It's very bland. It's very, no specifics, no names, no nothing. And yet, sorry about that. I'm going to blame my kids on that one for the internet cutting out. Anyway, during the 1619 project, or the purpose of the 1619 project, is trying to educate based upon the perspective of those that were not depicted in a typical history book. So when I pick up a typical textbook, whose story am I really telling? Most of the time I'm telling white America's story. And this is what a lot of minorities, whether it be African Americans, Asians, Latino Americans, and even females, will come across and say, hey, the only story that we're really getting is the story of one group of people, white males, and typically white Christian males. So the 1619 Project gets its name from 1619, which is the year that the first African slaves were delivered to Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was founded in 1607. 12 years later, John Rolfe, who was one of the leaders of the colony, he had married Pocahontas, he was a fairly influential person within Jamestown, wrote to the colonial owners, which was the East India Company. He wrote in to the journal back to his investors, hey, this ship came by and dropped off 20 or so African Americans, and they were immediately put into slavery. And he kind of writes it out, and it's almost kind of matter of fact, like they dropped their cargo, is kind of how he puts it. So and this is kind of the start of the 1619 project, is talking about trying to give a voice to the voiceless, trying to tell the story from the perspective of the first people that were brought here from Africa all the way up to the modern day. Trying to kind of put a voice into a minority perspective. Now, this was very controversial. It still is. It's been somewhat recent in its advent. It's been certainly pushed by people like Ibram Kendi, who is the author of your book that you're reading. He just released this book that I'm very, very early into, where he's almost trying to justify the 1619 project as a course of study. It's kind of an appeal to people like me to branch out and teach American history that's a little bit more inclusive in his mind. Now, some people have fought against this and said, well, wait a minute, we barely have time to talk about the history that is in that textbook because that textbook's very thick. What they're really talking about here is having a bigger viewpoint of American history. And of course, this has been an argument back and forth. There are those that want more traditional history taught, which a lot of people on the other side are saying, well, that's a nice racist way of looking at things. We only want the history to be traditional because traditionally the way we've taught it has been from the white Christian male perspective. So you have to kind of be mindful of this, because even though you're seniors and you're moving on and you're eventually going to become, members of our economy and, society and whatever else, some of you may choose to have children. And someday those children will be going through a school district. And you have to be mindful of what type of education do you want your children to be receiving? Do you want the children to receive a traditional American history, or do you want it to be a little bit more representative? Right? And that's really what the 1619 project's trying to do. And they're also trying to dispel a lot of racial undertones that are in our history. And that's what chapter 2 is all about. The race theories that were brought up by Kendi and Reynolds in the text were the climate theory and the curse theory. Now, we kind of went through the curse theory last week when I put out the video about the curse of Ham, the character in the Bible who was a son of Moses and was cursed. His descendants were cursed because of an incident he had with his father. That had been played up a whole bunch because it was so easy to use the Bible as justification for really anything back then. Climate theory was Aristotle's theory that people were inferior based upon the climate that they come from. That, if you are in a very hot and humid climate, that you don't have the same brain development as somebody that grows up in a more less humid, a less hot climate, that it's a little bit more, as he would put it, Mediterranean. Because think about the perspective he's talking about. If you grew up in what is today Greece, which is around the Mediterranean, or you grew up in Rome, which of course the Romans are going to embrace this wholeheartedly, that's a Mediterranean climate. What they're arguing is if you were born and raised in the Middle East where it's 120 degrees, or you were born and raised in Africa where it's super hot and super humid because you're on the equator, you're not as well developed. You're not capable of doing things that everybody else is able to do in the more northern regions. It's a nice and simple way to look at things and just kind of sew up that we're better up here, they're worse down there. Now, of course, those were the two race theories that were still permeating European mentality as they're settling the colonies. So it just kind of feeds into not only colonialism, where they're kind of seizing the territory from Native Americans, but they're also using these to justify the slavery that is going on, that the Portuguese, the Spanish, the English, and the French are all going to be promoting, and the Dutch for that matter. And William Perkins was brought up in chapter 2 as the family, that this is a family and the slaves are part of the family. They're just a different part of the family. They have different roles. And what he's kind of trying to say is, think of a typical farming family. The father runs everything in the fields. The mother runs the household. The children help out. They have chores and roles, and the slaves have a role within the plantation society. It's a nice way of justifying what we all know today is wrong. Okay. And of course, he then moves on and starts talking about the Puritans, and that'll be a bigger piece moving forward. But the idea that he's trying to get here is, from the very beginning, there is a hierarchy of races, that the whites feel that they are at the top and everybody else is somewhere below them. And keep in mind, it's a hierarchy also of men over women. It's white Christian male domination. And he's kind of setting the stage for his argument that white male domination from the start has influenced our teaching of history from the beginning. And that's kind of where this 1619 project comes in. That's the basic tenor of chapter 2, if you weren't quite understanding where they were coming from with any of this. And of course, they're going to justify a lot of the crop, usage, crop workers for tobacco to also then say, well, we're not just putting them out in the field to work. We're also teaching them the Bible. We're doing God's work on earth. We're recruiting. We're, creating new Christians who will then, because they found Jesus, be able to go to heaven. So again, another rationalization for what we all know today to be wrong. Okay, so kind of just a general idea for chapter 2. Now, your assignment last week was the map activity. Hopefully you kind of understood what I was doing with that, with geography and the just lack of knowledge of the 54 nations that make up Africa, that most Americans can't do that map. Most Americans look at that map and they're completely clueless. And it's not like, when somebody looks at the United States and they start naming the states and they go, oh, Mississippi, I know it's somewhere in the South. It's one of these right here. They say Ghana and you're down by South Africa, or they say Egypt and you're like, I don't know, it's somewhere in the north there. There are far too many people would look at Africa as a continent as opposed to the 54 separate and distinct nations that they are. So again, it's really understanding the world, and we don't do a very good job of teaching that inside the United States. I mean, geography in general is not taught very well inside the United States, but it's really apparent that most Americans can at least look at a map of Europe and know where Germany is, know where Italy is, know where Spain is. They kind of have a general idea where the bigger nations in Europe are. In Asia, you kind of have a general idea where China is. You have a general idea of Japan as an island chain. Most Americans can look and say, well, the Philippines are a group of islands, so I know kind of generally where they would be. Some Americans would know where Vietnam is just because of the Vietnam conflict. But when you look at Africa, most Americans would look at it and go, well, I can do South Africa and that's about it, maybe Egypt. But if I was to bring up Senegal or Sudan or something like that, which are big nations, important nations when it comes to economy, most Americans struggle. They can't do it. And again, that's kind of indicative of our educational system, but it's also the care and consideration we give to certain groups of people. Do we really value that society if we're not teaching about it? And think about the two nations that I brought up from the very beginning: South Africa, which is was run for a long time by a white minority under what was known as apartheid. So it was front page news for a very long time. And Egypt, which we study when we're in 3rd grade, 4th grade type stuff, I studied about mummies. I studied about, the pharaohs and all that. And of course, we know where those two nations are, but what about the rest? Do we know anything about Chad? Do we know anything about, Madagascar other than a cartoon movie? Do you know anything about it? Do you know anything about Somalia other than pirates and the fact that we had to go over and fight a conflict at one point there? Again, it's kind of, we don't know where these places are until we're involved. And that's kind of unfortunate, especially if you're in the military. Think about if you have to go serve in a country you didn't even know existed until you joined the military. You don't know the people, you don't know the culture, you don't know the climate, you don't know anything about the place, but now you're asked to serve in that location for your country. So again, it's kind of a big deal when we're talking about educational structure and strategy. That's where Kendi's kind of coming from. So this week you have 2 assignments. The 2 assignments are pretty simple. They're watching a quick little video and doing a question response. It shouldn't take you very long. It's mostly effort based. So it's asking, one of them is asking about holidays, and they're highlighting Christopher Columbus Day. They're saying Columbus Day is a useless holiday. Why do we still do this? So there's a question associated with that. And then there's a question associated with whitewashing, which is kind of what Kendi is making the argument is happening in history textbooks, that we're whitewashing history to make it more, traditional, if you will, or more acceptable to the general population. Whitewashing happens in other areas as well. Specifically, Hollywood is what they're talking about in that little video clip. And I ask you a question associated with that. Those are the two assignments. The third thing you have to do is, of course, read chapter 3. Chapter 3 is on rebellions that happen in the colonies. And of course, one of them is going to be a white man rebelling, and the other one's going to be an African American rebelling. And guess which one holds more time and more attention within the history textbook? It shouldn't be too surprising, and Kendi's going to kind of bring that out in chapter 3. So those are your assignments for the week. Hopefully everybody's staying safe and staying healthy. I appreciate the three of you hanging on, not only logging on, but hanging on during my tech glitch here. But again, if you have any questions, you can hang back. Otherwise, have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay warm out there, folks.
Thank you. You too.